Good afternoon and welcome, Kwe Jalasi. This is the third of three expert panels focused on the question of how do we move forward the political, the moral, the legal commitments to advance Indigenous and non-Indigenous reconciliation. So my name is Constance McIntosh. I'm the acting scholarly director of the McEachern Institute for Public Policy and Governance and a professor at the Schulich School of Law. And Dalhousie, where I'm streaming to you from, it's located in Shabuktuk, Mi'kmaq. This is the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. And here our relationships are governed by the peace and friendship treaties that were entered into in the 1700s and which continue to be enforced today. Now, to start our event rightfully, I would now like to introduce Nakawe Elder Jerry Musqua LeBlanc, who has been very graciously providing us with opening prayers and her good wishes. Elder Jerry is a Bear Clan knowledge keeper and a residential school survivor from Kisiku's First Nation in Saskatchewan. And we are so honored and delighted that she's agreed to work with us here in Shabuktuk as the co-coordinators of the Elders in Residence program at Dalhousie University. I'm going to turn it over to you, Elder Jerry.
Thank you, and good morning, or good afternoon. I guess it's afternoon now. My name is Jerry Musqua LeBlanc. I'm an Anishinaabe Kwe from Kisiku's First Nation in Saskatchewan. Mi'kmaq has been my home for decades, and I thank the Mi'kmaq for letting me practice my traditions on their territory. I have been given the honor of offering a blessing to this panel discussion, and the previous two panel discussions, which is a very wonderful, wonderful discussions to have. Creator, Jimanitu Gizok, Nindisnakas Misquiginukwe, Nindo Demakwa, Nindujuba Kisikus, Mi'kmaq Dash Ninda Nungum. Great Spirit and Creator of all things, we honor you with this prayer. We are the descendants of the many peoples you so long ago chose to live in harmony on Turtle Island. We give thanks for allowing us all to gather here today. Good Creator, more than ever, we need your strength, guidance, and truth. Give us the ability to recognize and use the gifts and teachings you have provided. Help us pass the virtues of respect and sharing to others. We direct our attention to the life forces on Mother Earth. She has given birth to all animal creatures and to all plants that nourish us. For this we give thanks. We ask that you help those who are experiencing difficulty and conflict in their lives find peace and comfort. We pray for our Mother Earth so that she may recover from the many sores we have inflicted upon her. We pray for the good of our nations, communities, our families, elders, leaders, and our medicine people. Creator, we humbly ask for your help so that the treaties between nations be respected, protected, and honored as they were intended for as long as the sun shines, the rivers flow, and the grass grows. Kichimenitu, we promise to work together so that all steps we take will become the path of peace for our future generations. Aho, all my relations. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Elder Jerry. That was beautiful. So today's panel discussion, it focuses on implementing the calls to justice of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry, right? We call it the MMIWG. That inquiry ran from 2016 to 2019, and its mandate was to look into the cases of Indigenous women, Indigenous girls who had been murdered, were missing, or who had died or disappeared under mysterious or suspicious circumstances. And there was to report on the systemic causes of all forms of violence against Indigenous women and girls, including those causes of systemic vulnerability. The inquiry made findings of genocide, colonialism, misogyny, racism. They also identified a route to hope and change, to a world where Indigenous women and girls live with justice and health and security and respect, And that route was through acting on 231 calls to justice that implicated all levels of government, industry, institutions, and included requiring a national action plan for implementation. It was 2 years later, a few months ago in June of 2021, shortly after the burial sites of 215 Indigenous children had been relocated on the Kamloops Indian Residential School grounds, when the federal government released that national action plan for implementation. And we have three amazing speakers here today who aren't just talkers, they are doers. They have records of making things change and fighting hard, especially for Indigenous women and girls. So I'm going to introduce each of them in turn as they give us their 10-minute opening comments, and then move to posing discussion questions to them. And if audience members have questions that they want to see posed, we can try typing them in with your name and if you're the media, which outlet, and we'll try to get to them, but I can't guarantee that, that we will, unfortunately. So we'll try. So introduce our first speaker, and that is Cheryl Simon. Professor Simon is a porcupine quill artist and lawyer from Epigwet, who has very successfully worked to address aspects of the gender discrimination that Indigenous women experience. She's worked with a number of Indigenous communities to refine their governance models away from the Indian Act, to mobilize their treaty rights. And she's mentored her young daughter and others in her amazing quill work artistry, which has supported them all in reconnecting with Mi'kmaq culture. She recently joined the faculty at the Schulich School of Law, where her knowledge and experience, and I'm going to say generosity, are all serving to reshape the foundations of legal education. Professor Simon, can you please share your opening comments with us?
Thank you, Constance. De Louise Cheryl Baxima, Watch. My name is Cheryl Simon, and I'm really humbled to be here today. And you can tell I'm a little emotional. And I think that I'm humble because of how many women have been fighting for so long to get their stories told and to get their voices heard. Because when Canada was created, there was a deliberate movement to build up a governance structure to deal with Indigenous people focused on men. So from the get-go, women's voices have been marginalized, gender diverse people have been marginalized, and what we've been left with is a governance system that actively repressed voices and actively repressed truth. So when I think about the situation of how far we've come today, I go back to PEI, where I'm from. I said it's Epigwet, which means that my family is of the island of PEI. And I grew up hearing about the struggles of my family to raise attention to these issues, because I think that Indigenous women have really been treated as if they were disposable. People would disappear and nothing was done. Nothing was done. My grandmother would send somebody down. Sorry, Constance, I know I'm really emotional here today. My grandmother would send somebody every day to call the RCMP to find out what happened to her baby sister. And she never got an answer to that. Her remains were found, but there was never a file opened. There was never an effort to locate her, the perpetrators of what happened to her. So when the push came to get the truth out about what has been happening in this country to Indigenous women, people look to the official records first, right? What's been documented? How big is this problem? And in PEI, the answer was there was no problem because the records were zero. There was no missing and murdered Indigenous women from PEI, zero. But the women knew better. The families knew better because they knew who had disappeared. They knew that there was an action being taken. And so when Amnesty International released their report in 2004, highlighting on an international level what was happening in Canada. That really validated the fight that women had been making for generations to get their voices heard, to get the truth out. And so in PEI, there was a lot of people started becoming aware of this issue. They started coming together to share stories. And I think that that was one thing that people were not expecting, was how common the stories were going to be. How many people had stories like my grandmother's. And people started having vigils. You started having small attendance at first, the Stolen Sisters, Sisters in Spirit. People started to come together and to support each other and to work through this trauma that had been buried for generations. And when PEI started working with the Status of Women, with other organizations that were willing to support them, you really saw a lot of effort that had never been demonstrated before by Canada. And I'm really proud of the people who testified at the inquiry, because PEI didn't have 0 cases. There was over 12. And then with all of the families that were part of that trauma, we had people that were not aware of what had happened to the older generations. We had children that were growing up not knowing, because the pain was so strong that people weren't talking about it. And one of the other threats with respect to this issue is that when justice hasn't been dealt with, then you don't know who the perpetrators are. You don't know how safe you are or how unsafe you are. Crimes would happen against women and you wouldn't know who it was. I've heard stories of people that were coming to the community where crimes had been committed against them, and they didn't know every time they looked around, was it you? Was it you? And there was a lot of uncertainty with it, a lot of pain. So when you talk about the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls inquiry, it really was the accumulation of like over a century and a half of effort to get women's voices heard. And what I really resent is that the way that Indigenous women's issues have been treated in this country really sets up a false dichotomy that if you're going to target programs or services or deal with women's issues, it pits us up against the self-governance movement, where people think that you're attacking the political structures that we've been fighting so hard to reclaim from the colonial system. And so you become even more marginalized as we move towards self-government. And that has been incredibly difficult to deal with, because it increases the lateral violence and it continues this segregation of women from their communities. So when I think about the people that testified and the strength that they showed, it wasn't the full picture. And it couldn't be, because a lot of people weren't able to tell their truths because they were still living in a state of fear. People, they had family members that would disappear and they suspected that they knew who it was. And that person is still alive. They're still in the community. They're still around. And PEI is a very, very small province. And when you're looking to work towards solutions, you're running up against the fact that first people have to see it as a problem. And I think that Canada generally has viewed, violence against Indigenous women as an Indigenous issue. They don't see it as a Canadian issue, that we have a system that's been put in place that has allowed this to happen. And when the women started rising up with it, the forces of the colonial state have really been harsh. Right from the beginning in the 80s, when they were talking about repatriating the Constitution, women were deliberately kept out of those discussions. So we have all of these factors, whether it's through justice, through governance, through socioeconomic components that are at play here, that are working together to keep people down. And when we talk about the systemic racism, what's really unfortunate about it is that the system itself creates the racism. So even if people are working within the system and they are good people who are not racist, they end up actually being part of a system that creates actions that keep people oppressed. And it's been good to see other people coming to be aware of that situation. It's not enough to view this as an Indigenous issue. This is a Canadian issue. And we've seen a resurgence, I think, of that responsibility of Canadians when it comes to protecting human rights for people. You know, people kind of go through cycles with it. And I think that right now we're seeing more people being aware of the individual actions that they can take. And so when you look at PEI, it's a small province. There's about 2,000 Indigenous people that live on the island. And people are starting to come together, right? When you're talking about the implementation of the action plan, we've got different organizations who have been quite compartmentalized, and they're starting to get together to work through these solutions and through these problems. And I know from my family, that has really been helpful to recover from the trauma, because people are having funds, they're making commitment, they're being supportive, and they're not just Indigenous people. And I think that if we're moving out of this colonial oppression, if we want to, we have to stop seeing this as an Indigenous problem and see it as a Canadian problem, and that it's not history, that this is something that is our present, and hopefully it will not be our future. I'm not sure how that is with respect to time, Constance. I forgot to make note of when I started speaking, but I just kind of wanted to highlight that with PEI, that one of the issues about it is going from people not seeing a problem and then seeing a problem that they thought that they weren't part of. And now that we've had the findings, people are understanding that the problem is extremely complicated, and intergenerational trauma is going to take intergenerational solutions to work through this. So we need to have firm commitments. We need people to understand the role that they have to play in this, because genocide is what's at risk. And we just really cannot afford that in this country.
Thank you so much, Cheryl, for sharing those honest, heartfelt, precise comments, your experiences and your insights to help guide us in this conversation. Really appreciate it. I'd like to introduce our second panelist now, and that's Dr. Cheryl Pictou. Dr. Pictou is Mi'kmaq from Elskook, and she is a trailblazer who just gets things done. She was a former chief for her community, co-chair of the World Forum of Fisher People, and currently holds a chair in Indigenous governance between law and management, and she's serving on international task force. Currently, she's the first female district chief for the Confederacy of the Mainland Mi'kmaq, and she, like Dr. Simon, is also a really proud mother of an amazing young woman. Over to you, Dr. Pictou.
Thank you so much, Constance, and thank you so much, Cheryl. Yeah, and I know that Debbie or Denise, sorry, Denise, will be adding a lot more. And I think I'll talk a little bit from a different angle on this in terms of the final inquiry report itself. And it is hard. It's hard to talk about these. And I kind of would like to dedicate my little contribution here to Tanya Brooks, who was found murdered in the old St. Patrick's School in 2009. Also to Chris Metallic, whose body was never found. He was attending Mount Allison in Sackville, New Brunswick. And that it's been so difficult to bring closure for that family. And of course, to Cassidy Bernard and so many others. And I think of Kathy Martin, who was the Nancy's chair at the Mount St. Vincent University in 2017, and really put a lot of work and facilitated in that travel and art piece of the Vamps, which people traveled from the United States to that in order to bring some type of healing for their loved ones. I want to talk a little bit about resource extraction and the type of violence that women face on so many multiple scales. And this is such a difficult thing to try to convey to people, like, why are those women protesting that? Or why are they trying to defend this or that? You know, and why are they, you know, so upset about what we term, and even it's in the report as man camps and so forth. And I want to just refer here to a quote from our elder Albert Marshall, elder Dr. Albert Marshall, and honor his late wife Medina Marshall, who is also an elder and doctor who mentored me, particularly in the 1990s. And Dr. Elder Albert Marshall's always talking about our inherent responsibilities in this Mi'kmaq concept, rather it's two-eyed seeing or Noduglamuk, and it's about how there's this interrelationship between humans and land and water, and those are our relatives as well as all of life. And he talks about how we have inherent responsibility to for ensuring that no action that we will ever take will compromise the ecological integrity of the area, because our overall objective is to ensure that the next 7 generations also will have the same opportunities as we have, and hopefully better opportunities than we have, of not just being able to sustain themselves and harvest the gifts from the Creator, but also to be able to enjoy and learn from her. And he's talking about Mother Earth in that context, just as our ancestors have learned from her. And I just really wanted to point that out. And so what I was keeping an eye, I was aware of the Cindy Gladwho case, which I just cannot talk about because it just brings so much emotion, because it's triggering for me for, now if I could say this without crying, of Denise's mom, and where body parts were involved. And I just thought it was so disrespectful of doing that. And in the 2000s for the Cindy Gladwho case. And it reminded me so much of what Denise's mom went through, Annie Mae Aquash. But what I was really particularly interested in is that throughout this country, we were seeing a lot of Indigenous women and gender diverse people taking the lead in terms of defending land and resources. And what was that all about? And just as Cheryl had said, like how they were just, how Indigenous women were sort of kind of cut right out of the Constitution processes way back in the 80s, this continues to be the case. And it's a little bit complicated, and I do not have a time to get into here about the consultation issue and how that stopped for the chief and council. So what was happening is that you find these projects were happening in your ancestral homelands, like the Alton Gas, where they're going to dig out all of this salt and out of these salt caverns, throw it into this river that's been the highway for the 7 traditional districts for generations. You find yourself having to navigate not only the provincial and federal governments, but also sometimes your own. And that's only because they're so intertwined with state and corporate driven processes. And I don't have time to go into that. And so what my concern has always been, do they have a voice? Why are they doing that? Why are they, risk getting arrested? And as we know, there's these 3 beautiful women defending Alton Gas that were arrested with up-team police cars, by the way. And you look at what's happening out with the Trans Mountain Pipeline and so forth. And so I worked really hard to try to create voice. And we just had a report that came out of the Mi'kmaq grandmothers. And I know Angela Day is on the call, and I have to give a shout out to her. She was so instrumental in helping me with that. In terms, we brought 2 groups of grandmothers together and really had an opportunity for them to share their stories. And we're so proud of the report. And when that was released just a few days before September 30th, we were trying to commemorate the TRC National Day and the Truth and Reconciliation. And there was a CBC reporter, and she couldn't get no response from any government at any level. And so we just eventually put out a press release a few days later. And then lo and behold, as we recently found out that Alton Gas is pulling out altogether. Hooray for us. Ooh, thank you. And so anyways, my concern is about being now left out of governance. And as Cheryl said, like, I mean, we didn't have the opportunity to vote in our own council, chief and council elections in 1951. We couldn't even run for them. And so I'll try to wrap this up in terms of it's, you know, there's this, I want to just talk about the land and water for a bit. This is our sources of life. This is where our Indigenous laws come from. This is our lifeways. And within those lifeways are very sacred roles for women and gender diverse persons. And this has been, you know, as you know, from the Indian Act, been just, you know, taken away from us. And it's, so when there's an assault on the land, it's an assault on our university. It's an assault on our school. It's assault because that is our school. That is our university. That's where we receive our teachings. And so those women who have been discriminated against and all this violence perpetrated against them, there's this other level of violence that happens when they do that, when they go out to defend the land and waters. First of all, there's the police brutality. And if anyone reads those reports, there's also local intimidation, misogyny, and so forth of men who've been promised jobs at these sites that will try to intimidate these women. And then you have in other extreme cases where when there is a correlating thing where where women will go missing or the violence escalates and so forth because of this influx of industrial workers or workers for the industry that are predominantly male. And so there's a convergence of all kinds of discrimination and violence that happens to Indigenous women at once. Rather, it is like they've lost their status, removal of a body by that way, and had to regain their status, and that's impacted generations. We have all this violence within our communities as a result of many other things. And then now to the very point, well, shouldn't say now, for 500 years, of trying to defend their sources of food, their sources of livelihood, their sources of life. And as I said, our ontological space, our university, our teachings, where our teachings come from. And so there's something inherently wrong when we are criminalized for doing this. And this is much more complicated than what I'm able to portray here, but this is something that I'm really interested in. And what I was really looking for in the report was the governance piece, and they nailed it. They have a really strong recommendation in there that Indigenous women and 2S LGBTQI people must be included in governance. And I'm particularly interested in governance over natural resources. And the recommendation did not just call on non-native governments, they called on all governments, and especially Indigenous governance, because we have internalized that to some extent, that even that we've been so displaced from governance roles. And so that is sort of where I'm at, and I'm a little bit leery of the gender-based analysis that has been around for some time within government, but now this is sort of taken over Indigenous affairs and so forth. Oh, we're going to do a gender-based analysis, and I don't think that can be just done in a very symbolic or tokenistic way, that it really has to be done from Indigenous women and gender diverse persons' perspective. And so that's what I'll kind of leave you with, other than with the final fact that, you know, I was discouraged when during the pandemic that the resource extractive industries was considered essential services, but the missing and murdered Indigenous women's filing inquiry report was put on hold. So I'll leave it with that. And it's all my relations.
Oh, thank you so much, Sherry, and in particular for bringing our attention to these other issues that are kind of sometimes not thought of as directly connecting and drawing our eyes to it. And that's so important. Governance piece. I'm going to introduce our third panelist now, who I'm so honored and grateful to her for joining us. And this is Denise Pictou Maloney. Ms. Maloney is a proud Mi'kmaq matriarch with very strong connections across Mi'kmaqi. She has worked her whole life to bring awareness to the injustices, the violence that's experienced by Indigenous women and girls, which she unfortunately knows firsthand. Her work is entirely grounded in community and working to amplify community voice. And that's what guides her in seeking real reform for Indigenous women's lives on the ground. As a part of this, Denise served as a staff member and a witness within the inquiry itself. And she also participated as a circle member with the National Family Survivors Circle to try to provide guidance and direction on how to rightfully engage families and survivors and 2SL LGBTQIA+ people in developing that federal action plan. And like Sherry and Cheryl, she's also a very proud mother. And I think this is a string that drives, all of us. We're looking to the future. So over to you, Denise.
Thank you so much, Constance, and thank you for listening today and joining us. I've got a lot of information to share with you. I'm going to try and get as much packed in as I can in my time allotted. But I first want to acknowledge, thank you, Sherry, for acknowledging my mother. And I'm going to be speaking to you as a family member in the challenges we faced in trying to move through a process and through systems that have done everything to act as barriers in having our voices heard. If you're not aware of what happened to my mother, she was murdered 46 years ago. And for 28 years, her case sat dormant because there were no systems in place. There was nothing that, in my knowledge at the time, was available to provide support for families who were engaged in murder trials. And speaking to, Cheryl's information she shared, we didn't have mechanisms in our communities even to be able to feel safe in speaking about what happened to us because of the lack of accountability, the lack of protections put in place. It prevented us from speaking our truth in a safe way. Our family moved through decades of letter writing. My mother was executed for speaking the truth and for daring to call out domestic violence and the corruption that had already cost others in her circle their lives. Lateral violence, jealousy, betrayal, gaslighting, and badjacking were all effective tactics that were used by her murderers to silence my mother in their efforts to justify their decision to execute her. For decades, her murder was deemed too controversial for many advocacy and organizations to take on. Cheryl, you mentioned Amnesty International. When they issued their Missing and Murdered Women's report, I had worked for 8 months with them to highlight my mother as one of the 100 cases in Canada that they were going to be profiling. And within months of launching that report, a man was arrested in her murder and they wrote a letter of support for him. So obviously that was not a safe space for us, so our family had to disengage. After almost a decade of letter writing and dismissals, that led nowhere. My mother's murder ended up sitting for 28 years before we saw the inside of a courtroom. So our family decided to take ownership and we began decades of campaigning for justice because as we quickly recognized, no one had the integrity or the authority to do that but ourselves. In 2004, it was confirmed that Anime Pictou Aquash's murder was a domestic event that was intentionally lied about by those who considered and conspired to protect those involved in her murder. For 28 years, her murderers and killers said it was the FBI who shot and killed her. In 2010, after 4 trials and eyewitness accounts of 23 witnesses that resulted in 2 convictions, a guilty plea, and an acquittal, it was proven that members of the American Indian Movement, Arlo Looking Cloud, Thelma Rios, Richard Vine Marshall, and John Graham, acting on AIM leadership orders, kidnapped, interrogated, which included a gun in the mouth interrogation by Leonard Peltier, beat, raped, and executed Anime Pictou Aquash. When it was thought that the FBI had killed my mother, we had fists in the air and community outcries for justice that included every advocacy group and organization in this country. When it was learned it was a domestic event and that her friends betrayed her and killed her, voices grew silent. Our family spent decades in silent agony as we moved through multiple hearings and trials with no external exports. So when a national inquiry was called, our family was elated. A national inquiry was called because despite large investments and funding dedicated to support missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, families, and survivors, the disproportionate numbers of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls continue to rise to crisis levels, and families were reporting high levels of severe neglect, exclusion, and injustice. As the final report states, the mandate of the national inquiry was to report on the systemic causes of all forms of violence and institutional policies and practices implemented in response to violence experienced by Indigenous women and girls in Canada. This included the identification and examination of practices that also have been effective in reducing violence and increasing safety. While there are many advocacy groups, organizations, and service providers that were positively impacting families and survivors, the high numbers of families needing support and the lack of long-term funding kept some families and survivors in vicious cycles and never completely achieving wellness. If they were fortunate enough to be in areas where there were services. Many organizations are left in a starvation cycle currently right now, and trying to maintain their funding streams and are not financially equipped to build the capacity to make the decision in the best interests of families, let alone address the enormity of decades of neglect. According to the final report, commissioners were tasked with the responsibility of making recommendations on concrete and effective action that can remove systemic causes of violence and to increase the safety of Indigenous women and girls, which included finding ways to commemorate and honor missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Our family struggled for many years in just trying to have that value for my mother. Every day that we were out in the public asking and demanding for justice, it was about the value of her life, that she mattered. And what we learned in this process is that there's no entity or mechanism out there that is completely inclusive or void of intergenerational trauma. We continuously acknowledge that throughout the process of the national inquiry, because families and survivors, if they were not neglected and if they were not devalued and dismissed so severely for decades before we actually hit the ground, we would not have needed a national inquiry in the first place. For many families, including my own, this was an opportunity to have a safe, unconditional, nonpartisan space to speak our truth. We know many families will never see the inside of a courtroom for their loved ones, and all they will have was this opportunity to speak their truth and have it documented and used towards solutions to end all forms of violence. So what was the result of 2 years of blood, sweat, and tears? It was a final report that, while not supported by some in the preliminary stages, was confidently upheld in the hands of many in the end, that provided evidence through testimony that Canada's neglect and treatment of Indigenous women and girls amounts to genocide. There's safety in moral ambiguity. I acknowledge, and many here listening today know, that there's great risk in speaking truth that challenges the patriarchy that we are governed by. There is risk that you will not be invited to the tables. There is risk in what I'm saying in daring to hold accountable the very systems that have profited and have trapped us in our oppression so that we can't even exercise our own autonomy and voice in a national inquiry without being criticized or silenced by those most threatened by the loss of that power. Our women are not in positions of doing what is right anymore. But rather we're faced with not upsetting the hand that feeds us. And we're choosing between what is safe and what is less risky. Imagine how healed and well we would be if Canada and its affiliates just for once could acknowledge the critical importance of centering the agency, the lived experience and expertise of our Indigenous women and girls and two-spirited people in this process, instead of getting caught up in the politics of airing grievances about a process that was about restoring our voices and reclaiming our inherent power and place to our Indigenous women and girls as matriarchs. The National Inquiry identified 4 pathways that maintain colonial violence in our sectors. And they state, in their descriptions of encounters, families and survivors who spoke at the National Inquiry consistently referred to 4 general ways in which their experiences were rooted in colonialism, both historic and modern forms. These 4 pathways continue to enforce the historic and contemporary manifestations of colonialism that led to additional violence. And they are, I'll list them now, historical, multi-generational, and intergenerational trauma, social and economic marginalization, maintaining the status quo and institutional lack of will, and ignoring the agency and expertise of Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA+ people. If we do not impress how critical it is to our leadership on all levels of governance that we move into the implementation phase of the 231 calls for justice with clear timelines, an accountability mechanism, and an ombudsperson who will continue, we will continue to be trapped in a Jordan's principle situation where governments on all levels waste valuable time arguing whose responsibility it is to implement the 231 calls for justice, while advocacy groups and organizations continue in their perpetual lottery of inadequate funds in maintaining the status quo. I watched this country move with lightning speed to come to the aid of its citizens during a global pandemic, and I say citizens in quotation marks, during a global pandemic that exponentially impacted our women and girls and put them at greater, higher risks, who did not have a safe place to harbor and hold and secure, and were left in domestic violence situations that left many homeless and their perpetrators safe at home. Transformative change and reconciliation are big words that get thrown around a lot. And my query is, who is divining those? Who is benefiting from those at the end of the day? As a family member, as a National Inquiry staff member, I think my greatest sense of disappointment in those 2 years was witnessing the dissension amongst many of my sisters, in the fear of the unknown and the truth. It divided us in something we all spent decades on the front lines, hand in hand, standing and fighting for. And I was disappointed to witness how the entities being scrutinized the most in this process suddenly became engineers in criticizing the truth of 2,380 people who put their trust in an independent body that didn't have dirty secrets and genocidal history to protect. There was active deflection at play here. Oppressors wanted us divided. They wanted to avoid transparency, truth, and accountability. Instead of criticizing an entity that was designed to give unconditional space for truth to families and survivors, the focus should have been on holding accountable those receiving billions of dollars on behalf of MMIWG's wellness. And yet here we are, 3 years later, with growing numbers of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, dirty water, food security issues, and a housing crisis. Missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in this country is a $1 billion industry. And it's pretty sad to consider that in 2021, as an Indigenous inherent matriarch in my own territory, I have a better chance of surviving if I'm an endangered species. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Denise. I have trouble speaking again after hearing from each of you, because I'm also experiencing this as an emotional, and I'm feeling where you're coming. So we're going to move into a focused series of discussion questions. And the first question is about how the inquiry labeled the situation in Canada genocide. And I'd appreciate it if maybe Cheryl, you'd like to start. If you could just share a comment on what it means to call this situation genocide.
I really welcomed the finding of genocide. I welcomed the finding of an unconditional genocide finding with this report, in contrast to the TRC, which had the cultural genocide definition attached to it. I think that Canadians generally were not prepared for that. And we have difficulty actually using even the word genocide to describe what has happened. People shield away from it. You'll say, oh, this is a problem. This is, issues like reconciliation is much more comfortable of a buzzword when it comes to this, what is required. And so when I read the supplementary report on genocide, it really challenged my understanding of what genocide means today, because I think like a lot of people, view genocide as something that happened in very specific circumstances. And when you look at what has happened, unfortunately, there has been an evolution of genocide in this world that we live in. And so you need to think about what it is that genocide means to you, educate yourself as to what genocide means today, and recognize that this is the appropriate finding for what has happened to Indigenous people in this country. And I think that when we frame it that way, when we're demanding action, it's not it's not about, oh, we need resources, we need, funding, this type of stuff. We're talking about fundamental violation of human rights that is ongoing, that has been taking place for centuries within the boundaries of this country. And we need to come to terms with that. So I find that basically people are watering down the language, and they're not comfortable using it. They're not comfortable being part of it. And I think that instead of demanding that the government stop condoning genocidal actions, people are preferring not to use the term. And so I like to use it and call it what it is as often as I can. We need to use the term, this is genocide. And you should never be comfortable with it, but you should be taking action to stop it. So I think that one of the ways that I've talked with people about how to kind of contextualize this finding of genocide is that, would it be more helpful if you look at everything that's happened to Indigenous people and narrow it down? Like, if it had happened within a decade, would it make more sense to you? If it had happened within 2 decades, but the fact that it's taken place over 154 years, people tend to view it as something that was kind of almost natural in terms of colonization that seems to have ended. And so when we use the word genocide, it completely changes the context. It makes it real, and it makes us all part of the problem and the solution. So I think that I would really call on people to call it what it is. We don't like saying the word racist. We don't like labeling people as racists. We don't like calling our government genocidal, and we need to do it because that is a truth that we all need to face.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. Sherry and Denise, did you want to add to that, or shall I pose another question?
Yeah, I'll just quickly add, thank you for that, Cheryl. Yeah, I think what had happened when the Truth and Reconciliation came out in 2015, and this came on the heels of 2019, there was a period of feeling good, or a feel good, touchy feel thing that we were all moving towards reconciliation. And when the hard reality came out about these missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and gender diverse persons, and those numbers, we still don't know the real numbers, right? That's why sometimes you'll hear 3 to 6 times, like they will go missing or were at risk of being murdered. And and so it's all, I think people were thinking that this was, oh, we're towards reconciliation. And as Cheryl said, the word genocide made that really uncomfortable. But to me, it just, it just showed how much more we have to do and how hard the work and how hard the journey is going to be. Just a few policies on reconciliation isn't going to just take away what has happened, or and by the way, and not prevent it from happening, because every single day there was a point where I couldn't go on Facebook or social media because somebody's always going missing or they're found murdered. And so there's nothing being done immediately. I think I shouldn't say that. There's some initiatives in some places, but for me, genocide is like colonialism. It's such a difficult term to educate others about, even my own students, because we've been trained to think that this is in the past. And as a lot of Indigenous scholars have done, and in their analysis, there are contemporary forms or extensions of historical colonialism. That's why we call it settler colonialism. And so, as Cheryl's saying, there's contemporary forms of genocide. We are still being dispossessed from our land. And though they finally removed the gender discrimination under the Indian Act in 2019, 1876 to 2019, is that a really A+ on a report card? The fact that we're still feeling the impacts, the gender discrimination impacts of all of that, and the horrific type of lateral violence within our Indigenous communities because of who is and who is not an Indigenous person as a result of the discrimination. This is removing our bodies. This is controlling our bodies. It was first legislated that we'll remove them by status. Now we'll remove them, or we'll continue to remove them from the land. And by golly, we will assert military state violence if they dare to try to protect their lands and resources from their lands and waters. And so yes, I think that was called for. It was very, I know he was forced to do it, but it was good to see the Prime Minister to use that word. But it's been a difficult concept for Canadians to think, I think, but it just goes to show that you cannot have reconciliation without healing. You cannot forgive, and the onus should not be on us always to forgive and make settlers feel that they're somehow reconciled. This is going to be a long journey. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sherry. Denise, I see you've turned on your microphone. It'd be great to hear from you on this.
Yeah, I think, thank you, Sherry, for acknowledging that. And Cheryl, my God, I just, my heart and my spirit and my head is so full today because of this conversation. We've been conditioned as a society, through our oppression, even in our own communities, that unless we see large numbers of people go missing or, killed in one space, then that has to be, or even in a decade, that considers to be, that's what's considered genocide, and it's defining of it, and it's a very colonial in structure. And I think our lead commissioner expressed it most at our closing ceremonies, that it's like dying by 1,000 paper cuts generationally through time, to carry that intergenerational trauma affects and impacts each and every layer of our existence. There's accountability there if Canada claims genocide. There is international courts that come in when you admit that you have participated in crimes against humanity. So I understand why they're not so quick to adopt. I'm not accepting it, but I know why. So I think Canadians have to be educated on what genocide means to Indigenous people in this country. And that when you have women at risk to go missing or murdered at 12 times, the national average, that there should be alarms going off, and that should be a big eye opener as to where we need to put our attentions in this country. It's easy to address dead children. It's more difficult to address women right in front of you who are at risk of dying. Thanks.
Thank you, Denise. I'm going to ask if the three of you could all comment or share some of your views on that federal action plan. And what I'm wondering about is, where and, how does it give you hope? And where do you think more is needed to effectively, implement those calls to justice? And maybe we'll start with Cheryl, and we'll just cycle through that way.
When I first actually thought about this as whether or not the report gives me hope, my initial response was yes, because we have recommendations, we're calling for action, they heard us. But then the more that I think about it, like, is that really all it takes for me to have hope as an Indigenous woman, that somebody heard our stories and that's it? The pandemic was used, I feel strongly, as an excuse not to follow through with the implementation. We have seen so much work get done in other areas during this period of the pandemic that we have not seen given to this report and the action plan. So I think that in the early days when it first came out, I did have hope. That is lessened now, right? It really has been, because I think that we have a vision plan. We don't really have an action plan yet. I don't see wide-scale movement of change. I see some governments and some different levels of governments and some groups are really working hard to bring about, the change that's required. But I don't see the country itself kicking into action to deal with this and to stop the genocide. So when I read the report, it sounds good, but I also had the same feeling when I read RCAP, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples report, Gathering Strength. I have the same feeling when I read the Penn report from the 80s. I have the same feeling when I read the TRC report. There are so many reports that have been done that have captured the actions of this state against Indigenous people, and including Indigenous women, because there was other reports that came out prior to the MMIWG, that I find myself actually getting increased in my frustration rather than an increase in my hope. So that is, I guess, the evolution since the report was delivered in June, which again, you look at the timing and how much are people trying to capitalize on our trauma after the bodies of the 215 children from the residential school were discovered. And so it became almost more of an embarrassment reaction from the government, I think. And I hope it's not, but again, I think I'm starting to get tired of hearing about change will come, because again, when you actively use the word genocide, that means that they are allowing the genocide to continue for 3 years at the very minimum, from the time that the report was issued, from the MMIWG inquiry, to the time that we're expecting to get an implementation plan, which they're saying in 2022. So for me, it's more of a horror that they were condoning genocide for 3 more years between those two timeframes.
Thank you, Cheryl. Sherry.
Yeah, I was pessimistic from the get-go, and some people call me cynicist but this is only because I've been around the tables, the negotiation tables, and see about treaties and land claims and so forth. And you see how those processes so easily become co-opted, particularly with the consultation process. You see who's driving the agenda. And so when this had come out, I was just really cynical, the action plan. And I'm hoping Denise can shed some light. I know it's very difficult because there has been some division. I'm really uncertain, because I know the Native Women's Association of Canada came out with their own action plan. I wasn't sure what that was all about. So that scares me a little bit as well, because the inquiry itself, as Denise knows, it had so many issues. It's remarkable. They are to be commended to even come out with the report and all those supplementary reports that they did. And I think, you know, again, it goes back to this touchy-feeling. When I say touchy-feely concept of reconciliation, I'm talking about on the government level. And we were so wrapped up in that. And so with the task force, and the other thing is, and I don't want to jump ahead of here, but I think the Missing Indigenous Women's Final Inquiry Report seems almost secondary to the TRC. And so anyways, and the irony of it is, just as Cheryl mentioned, all those other reports I've written about this RCAP, and then jump ahead 20 some odd years, you go and you look at what the United Nations are even saying. Jump ahead, look at this Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Final Inquiry Report. We have all of these different reports. We have the TRC and so forth. And if I recall correctly, the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Final Inquiry Report speaks to that. They speak about what, you know, they even investigate, like, why aren't the recommendations of these reports being implemented and so forth. And that's the honor of it, because they speak quite highly of the TRC in terms of child welfare, residential schools, health, policing, and all of those things that the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Final Inquiry, that relates to women. And what I always talk about when we talk about these graves of these children being discovered, it's so horrific. But I think it was Marie Sinclair who said why people were so angry was because we've been saying this. We said that throughout the TRC and no one believed us. And so here it is. And it shouldn't have been a shock. The country reacted as though this was a shock. If they looked at the TRC, they look at the RCAP from 1996, this should have not been a shock. And where am I going with this? And so basically, so when the final action plan came out, I don't think it's as serious. I think I lost my train of thought there with the TRC. But one of the things I wanted to mention is that this gender based analysis, and particularly trying to do that from an anti-colonial or from an, as I say, an Indigenous feminist perspective, is really difficult work, and it just can't be surface. And one of the things that I noticed, and I had a panic attack last evening because I thought, geez, did they change it or whatever? But it was in the volume B on page 89, and I think I misquoted that once at one point, but they were saying, like, the gender-based analyses needs to take place of all policies and recommendations, including landmark documents such as the TRC Commission's calls to action. I thought that very interesting. I found that very interesting. So my fear is that this is going to move forward, but it's going to be from a social deficit perspective, and that there's so many different intersecting layers of police and safety and so forth, but it's the governance piece that I'm worried about, because will we be sitting here like this is the first time, Denise, I heard 12 times. Will we be sitting here 10 years? It'll be 30 times. Do you know what I'm saying? And so I'm a little bit skeptical, but I hope that we can get it together. And I'm hoping that, you know, my short term here on earth, that I can provide that some contribution to the governance piece, because I think we need to hear from women and gender diverse persons themselves. I think they should be leading the process. We cannot just assume, and like Denise and Cheryl saying, like, this is a multi-million-dollar business now, the TRC and the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Final Inquiry Report. And so will this prevent what is happening right now? Will this prevent the escalation of missing and murdered Indigenous women? We'll see. And will it be superficial? Like, will it only be insofar that it doesn't really change? It'll be like Band-Aid solutions, and it won't change the structures that have evolved over hundreds of years to the place that we are at now. So, thank you. Sorry for that long sermon. You could tell, Constance, that we're all just like passionately involved in this.
I love the passion. I thank you for bringing it to this conversation. We are going to circle back to the TRC because I think it's really important to put that on the table squarely. But first, Denise, I'd like to give you the opportunity, as
Yeah,
someone who
so-
was really on the inside of the federal action plan. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, yeah, and I will say that I'll speak as a family member today. And the reason being is that if there was anything that I learned through my time with the National Inquiry and the work that I'd done before any inquiry existed, was that we have to have hope because we don't have anything else. This is it. I mean, we could barely hold on to the National Inquiry because of the colonial violence that infected our own backyards. The fact that they followed the principles of change in the National Action Plan, which is literally a guide in how to implement the 231 calls for justice, gives me hope that on paper, yes, but in my lessons, my teachings that I've learned is that we have to, as women, reclaim our power in place. And that means holding those entities accountable for the actions that directly impact us, pulling families to the table, respecting their agency, respecting their lived experience, and guiding you how you come to solutions. And we strategically will never be able to move forward until we start making that, we normalize that practice. We know how to heal ourselves. We don't have the resources. We don't have the capacity. And that's the problem. That's what keeps us hostage in this state of dependency and victimization. There has to be more hope in our circles. The idea of unifying to push these through, like that is something I'm so passionate, but I can't even get to the tables to have these. So maybe we start gathering as women, as matriarchs, and that we're all accountable and responsible to carry this forward. The federal government has been in caretaker conventions for the last several months, add a 2-year delay with the national pandemic or the global pandemic we just went through. Am I surprised that we're not further ahead? Nope. Am I disappointed? Yes. However, that doesn't stop me from moving forward and trying to be strategic and finding ways of forcing and pushing that envelope through and making sure that our women and girls are protected and that we are able to reclaim our value and our place in our society. My mother lost her life for standing up and saying the things that I'm saying, because governance and patriarchal systems don't want to hear about women reclaiming their power in place. It's scary for them. And it's not about taking things away. It's about being treated equitably and being brought to those tables as part of the solutions. Until we can get our own backyards to do that, then how are we going to hold other people accountable in doing that? Thanks.
Thank you, Denise. Several of you have already, made some references to the TRC, it's the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and its calls to action. And I'd be really interested in whether we could flesh that out a little bit more on the relationship between the calls to action and the calls to justice of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Inquiry. And maybe comment on why, in my perspective, it looks like the calls to action have gotten a bit more attention than the calls to justice. But I'll leave it to you, where you'd like to take your comments. Maybe Cheryl, we'll start with you.
I think there's a very simple answer to that question, and the word is patriarchy. When you look at people's response to the TRC, it was something that, for a lot of people, the residential school issues was brand new. It affected people across, like many genders, and it was targeting children, right? So people's responses to it were different than the murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, because the very reason we have the MMIWG is because Indigenous women were viewed as disposable, because Indigenous women and girls were not valued, they don't count. If we start incorporating these notions of equality, then we're going to tear apart governance structures that have been put in place and people are benefiting from, as Denise is saying. And so I think that the qualified finding of genocide, I think that the buzzword of reconciliation, and it kind of it didn't include it didn't include the problem from women. And I think when you think about children, like, like the notions of victimhood and who was involved and suffered from the different systems, people respond differently to it. You have all of the stereotypes about Indigenous women coming into play, whether or not people are willing to accept that reality. You're challenging people's perceptions of how they view ethnic groups. You're charging people's, like, you're demanding a paradigm shift. And I think if it was that simple, then we wouldn't have had to have the MIWG after the TRC. You hear people talking about, like I made the point earlier about the governance, it sets up a false dichotomy, right? There's a lot of people who think that we need to decolonize, we need to get our governments strong before we take action, but they're ignoring the fact that as it stands, completely marginalizes women and gender diverse people. We're not used to thinking about colonialism as something that affects gender identity. We're not used to thinking of the just male and female as a colonial concepts, right? We're just not used to thinking of it that way. So I think that it's getting more attention. It's getting read more maybe than the MIWG, because if they're going to deal with problems and if they're going to tackle stereotypes and misconceptions and who are to blame, it's easier to kind of think about schools and children than it is for women, because we've always been taught in Canadian society that Indigenous women are disposable. And it really pains me to say that, but the very reason we have the problem is also the reason why the response is the way that it is.
Thank you, Cheryl. Sherry.
I don't know if I can say any more about it than what I already have. I think they both intersect. I think we have to really read through those. We have to really try to understand where those recommendations are coming from. And remember, there's the calls to action with the TRC, and there's the calls to justice with the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Final Inquiry Report. And a lot of that is, I was just attempting to answer some of the questions in the chat, is upholding the Universal Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Like if we upheld, or if we implemented, even if we went back to RCAP and implemented, some of those recommendations, and we upheld all the international instruments that are available to us, such as the Universal Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, the human rights, the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, and so forth. Would we be in this position, as like Cheryl was saying, so I think the tools are there, and we have to really start questioning, well, why isn't this being implemented? And again, I would, bureaucracies have a tendency, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, to kind of take over real grassroots processes. And again, I would defer, just as any good researcher would, well, what's happening on the ground? What's happening at that grassroots level? Let's create a space for them to guide this process. And I really have to apologize, Constance. I know this is shortly coming to an end. But if anyone has any follow-up questions specifically to me, please don't hesitate to contact me. I really thought, I don't know why, in my head that this was an hour, and I really have to try to get back to the other meeting and then get up to the university to teach. So I want to thank my sisters on the call, Denise and Cheryl, and it's been such an honor, and thanks for those brilliant questions. And I hope that our contributions today have enlightened you in some way to further investigate these issues, to look at the final inquiry report. I wrote a very critical piece about the report, not the report itself, but it was more of some of the policies, the direction that the federal government was going, called decolonize and decolonization. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sherry. Take care.
Thank you.
And I know that Sherry's got to go teach Indigenous feminism this afternoon, which is pretty fantastic. way for her to be moving towards. Denise, can I ask for your comments, please?
Sure. I think that one of the things notably between the two final reports, and of course me being intimately connected to the national inquiry, is the difference in the relationships. So they are interconnected. Missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls is a symptom of the residential school system. We literally are intergenerationally connected. It's really easy for mechanisms in our country to separate them because it's about comfort, as Cheryl so eloquently expressed. But the difference that we really need to hold on to and cling to is that, unlike the TRC, the National Inquiry produced 231 calls for justice that are legal imperatives. Canada has a legal obligation that they have to implement them. And these 231 calls for justice are the women's voices. We're not talking about policymakers sitting around a table deciding what's best for Indigenous women and girls. These is testimony. So law-based evidentiary testimony that shared the gaps in this country. You have over 1,000 pages of authority sitting in the National Inquiry's final report. So I cannot express how important it is to read it front to end. Take your time, take a month, take 6 months, read it. Literally has the formula, the plan, what people need to do, and you can start doing it. You don't have to wait for the governance to tell you to do it. Each and every Canadian can do something in that book that works towards the change that we need to protect our women and girls. We got a lot of criticism coming out of the gates because people were quite concerned. Oh, why a national inquiry for women? Why not the men and the boys? Using a gendered specific lens wasn't about excluding anyone. It's giving voice to historical discriminated individuals based on their gender. We know that this is a thing in Canada and globally. This is the first time in history our women, Indigenous women and girls, and to us LGBTQIA+ people have been given a platform on a national level that focuses on their safety and welfare, even if it was short-lived. An inquiry that's gender specific also opens up the door, not just to look after colonial violence, but gendered colonial violence. So there's a double hit there. And why wouldn't we take advantage? And I want to remind folks, where do our men and boys come from? They come from us. And if we're not healthy, we're not safe, there's no men and boys. I want to say that it has been an absolute honor to be here sharing this time with everyone. And I'm really quite impressed with the direction that this conversation went to. I will admit, sometimes coming to the table and knowing the conversations that have happened up to this level of discussion involving the final report, I am heartwarmed to know that people are educating themselves and doing what they can as Canadians to move this and stop this and end this violence that takes our lives. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Denise. I feel like that's a beautiful way to bring our conversation to a close. Cheryl, did you want to add a closing comment, something that you want to share before we wrap up?
I think that I would echo Denise and asking, challenging people, maybe not asking, challenging people to read the reports, read all of them. Read all of them, and you will understand why the messaging from Indigenous people has been consistent. It's been consistent because the problems have been consistent, and the solutions are requiring action, and we're going to continue to demand that. So it's not going to be an easy solution, but it's definitely something that we all have a vested interest in. And if you're uncomfortable with the idea that you as a Canadian are, a party to genocidal actions because of what the system has put in place, then we all need to do something about it. This is not just an Indigenous issue. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for Denise and Cheryl and Sherry in absence for participating in this discussion. So we're out of time, and I want to thank you so much for sharing your your life experiences and your knowledge. It's so rich and it's so powerful to hear directly from you. And it's so brave of you to give a piece of yourselves to us today. Thank you for everyone who joined us for this session. There will be a video recording of the panel discussion on the McEachern Institute's YouTube channel and website. And feel free to tell everybody you know about it and to share it and to watch it and hopefully talk about it, right? Watch part of it and then think. The next week, we're having a very different sort of event. It's on transparency, power, and influence in pharmaceuticals. And you're all welcome to come back for that one. And so to all of you, I say, Walalan, thank you, take care, and stay safe.